you know, most of us in our schooling at some point or another, as Westerners, are told that history and that our culture begins with the Greek and the Romans. At the same point, we're told in one sentence that Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization, but that's never really explained to us. Recently, there's been all of this looting, both of the museum in Baghdad and of the archaeological sites. Why should anyone care? Why is Mesopotamia important? This might not be clearly apparent to a lot of people. It wouldn't be to me if I hadn't studied in this field.
Okay. David, I think there are several questions involved, actually. You know, the heritage we have from Greek and Roman times is the standard of our education since the humanistic period. In classical studies, people are much more aware nowadays of the dependencies the ancient Greek and therefore the Romans had on the culture of the ancient Near East. So the scholarly attitude nowadays changed to reckon the influence of ancient Near Eastern culture to the building of the Greek and Roman civilization. Therefore, I think it is quite obvious in terms of scholarly research at universities that you have this heavy impact of the East, of the ancient Near Eastern cultures to our civilization. The labeling as cradle of civilization, of course, is a very convenient one, but doesn't tell us very much. Let me mention a few points. First of all, most probably writing was invented at the end of the 4th millennium in southern Mesopotamia. It's usually connected with the city of Uruk. The invention of writing is not just for record keeping and these sort of things. It also has an impact on the thinking of the people. It was the first time that you actually could cross the borders of space and time with your messages. And when you look at the earliest text we have, there are two different types of text. The first one are the lexical texts. The second one are the administrative text, meaning record keeping in the households of the temples or palaces, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And what do we mean by lexical texts exactly? Lexical
texts are texts actually which have later on a tradition till the end of the 1st century. They put together usually items, words, classified according to different subjects. For instance, you have lexical texts which number the names of stones. You have texts which number the names of professions. And this gives you quite an interesting insight on the organization of the society at these times. Writing, to ask the second part of your question, writing of course is the precondition to a lot of other developments in civilization. Law, for instance, you can think of really law in our sense without writing. Hierarchization in administrative and societal structures necessary connected with writing, and a lot of such things more.
When you say law, most people think of law as beginning with Hammurabi. Do we have much earlier examples of this? I mean, where does this concept of law of codifying human behavior really begin?
You see, that is a good example to show the traditional attitude. If we spoke about ancient Eastern law, let us say, till 30, 40 years ago, people used to look at it under the from the viewpoint of Roman law, which is the most famous ancient law we know of. Nowadays, I think there's a little bit of change that we try to explore the emic traditions of this law. What does law mean? Law is a way actually to resolve conflicts occurring within the society. And you do not need, for the beginning, you do not need, of course, written records to do so. Maybe the chief in a society just decides what's going on. But as soon as you need more than oral witnesses, written records become very necessary. And you can show in ancient Near East that the development of property rights, which are still today one of the basic issues of law, is strictly connected with the invention of writing. You could keep the records of the fields you, your family, or your tribe owned in your home, and if there was a dispute about the land property, of course you could show this written document much in the same way as we do nowadays. And this started in the ancient Near East and has, of course, a big influence in the concept of property. And I do not know if I really can answer it. You see, you have, of course, let us say, explosion of population in these times. You have such demographic factors which play a considerable role. But I hesitate actually to say that is the reason why that occurs. I'm very skeptical about these monocausal attitudes you often find in, let's say, more general literature. To mention one example, you know the case of Wittfogel, who wrote a book about Oriental despotism, where he tried to connect the necessity to manage the water courses in southern Mesopotamia, in China, in Egypt, and in India, to the fact that this so-called high civilization sprang up. This was a model which has certainly at the core some convincing arguments, but if you exaggerate it and use it as a monocausal explanation, you fail. There are other ways you can manage water courses than through a strict hierarchical organization. And, so that is not a necessary way civilization must have. As you correctly said, I think that in general, you know, Homo sapiens is much the same as 1,000 and 10,000, maybe even 1 million a year ago. But the adaptation to the surrounding took several paths in various societies. One of the paths which we follow actually was laid out in the ancient Near East. You must not necessarily like it. I think you should refrain from considering history under an evolutionary paradigm. So,
you can back up and repeat that sentence if you like.
Yes, I think we should refrain from considering historical evolution, historical development or historical changes under evolutionary paradigm. That's not a very good one for explanation, because it always implies that you look down at other societies, at other groups, at other civilizations, and I think there's very little reason to do so. If you think of a civilization in the 3rd millennium in Mesopotamia, there are several paths possible of development this civilization. Then for certain reasons, and the reasons are difficult to name, for certain reasons the society took this or that path. And this actually is the background we are following till nowadays. What we should not overlook, in fact, is that a lot of possibilities inherent in these societies are forgotten nowadays. And I think that is a very important thing, that we can learn from these societies other possible models than ours. So the comparison between our very restricted, let us say, economized culture to those possibilities you had 5,000 years ago, that is one of the main interesting things for any historian, I think.
So routes not taken.
So?
Routes not taken.
Yeah.
Paths not taken.
Nearly everybody, at least in Europe, was shocked about the plundering and the looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. That was our starting point. And I get several calls from the television, from Austrian television, from radio, from newspapers, not only me, colleagues of mine as well, said, what happens here? What do you know about it? We like to inform our public. And yeah, as you know, scholars are sometimes very reluctant to give public opinions on such subjects because they are, some of them at least, are afraid to be involved politically in a certain respect. And I thought, well, this is a time actually. Scholars in the Oriental studies are asked, and we must provide an answer. We can't refrain and sit in this famous ivory tower and say, well, we are doing our work, and what is happening in Iraq doesn't concern it. That was the beginning. I don't remember the actual date when the plundering of the Iraq Museum.
Actually, April 14th or so.
Yeah, so in May I contacted my friends and colleagues, and then within 1 month, we put this conference into working, which was a pretty short time and only was possible because the interest of everybody was so great at the time. Well, yes, this efforts by the Austrian military to train officers in the protection of cultural heritage in the case of war has quite a long tradition. It goes back to the 50s, I think. And they did a wonderful job in Bosnia when the war in Bosnia and the civil war actually occurred in Bosnia. And they're still involved today in rebuilding churches and organizing conferences on such things. And there are several armies now in Central Europe actually joining this effort. So it's not only an Austrian effort anymore, it's an effort which involves the Italian officers, German officers, Swiss officers, I think. 7 or 8 countries who share in training the people, the military people, how they could behave in case of war, what should be protected, that they know where to go, where not, to avoid actual fighting. All the things you have to do it beforehand, you know. After it's too late, as we see, as it happened in Iraq. Apparently the American forces were not very well aware of this threat to the cultural heritage there. And so, for instance, it made a use here that the oil ministry was heavily guarded by American troops, but nobody was actually looking after the universities or the world-famous Iraq Museum, which is one of the biggest and most important museums in the world.
One of the things that I wanted to get back to, because we touched upon the issue of propaganda, and by the way, propaganda is a word that I'm very uncomfortable with, because in a sense one associates it with a modern form of media, with television or with radio, or with film. But I don't really know what to substitute for it. It would be something like images that convey certain messages by the ruling elite, images of state power or of authority. This is, of course, one area which, in a sense, you're quite expert in. You may not think about yourself as possessing that type of expertise, but you have spent a lifetime studying very early messages, both textual and visual, that are formulated on the parts of ruling elites. What are some similarities that you might see between the types of messages that are being put out by groups like the US government, groups like even Muqtada al-Sadr, groups like the Iranian government? Go with this anywhere you will. It's just a sort of general question about how states formulate ideologies.
Well, between the groups, meaning that I say I call them Christian fundamentalism in the United States, Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq, or the Third Millennium Society in Mesopotamia. They have a lot in common, I must say. You know, first of all, the concept of propaganda usually focuses that you propose something you do not believe in. that you only argue to bring people in a certain direction which is useful for you, but not necessarily that you share to this sort of beliefs you propagandize. My feeling is that a number of these people actually really believe what they're doing, as quite a number, by the way, again, of the Nazis really thought they were correct. They believed in the stuff they did. As strange as it seems from our day's point of view. And I think this is a very, very dangerous thing. The difference between the third millennium Mesopotamia is that you probably had what we would call an ideology or belief, which was on a much broader extent shared by every Mesopotamian at the time. So you only could put certain accents to it. That means that you, for instance, could try to strengthen your position as a leader by certain ways of legitimization and such things, but after all, you were judged by the general, what I would call the humanism of this time. And I wonder if this is still in the 20th and the 21st century is still true for our world. I sometimes have the feeling not. I have the feeling that quite a number of groups, especially those called fundamentalistic groups, actually have left this common shared humanism.
If you engage in smoking, it's a personal choice about your health. That we live in a world where there seem to be certain standards of behavior that are codified by the media or by governments. So for instance, smoking is something that you simply should not do because it's bad for your health. But you can actually make the personal decision that you don't care if something is bad for your health. Do we live in a world where there actually, for some reason or other, there are less types of personal choices like this, that media has changed us in some type of way, or propaganda or image making or rhetoric is somehow more powerful? When you go back to the idea that you were talking about there being sort of these norms that all Sumerians held that had to be adhered to in image making or in state messages, and that you wonder whether this is less true today. What do you think the reasons might be for that distinction?
Well, let me take an example from economic history. Economic history in Mesopotamia is a very important and well documented topic. And you had similar problems that we have today, that government spending must be somehow counted by taxes and other ways of income. And let us say that things like military or health costs quite a bit for these governments, and we can observe the measurements the ancient governments undertook, to balance their economy. And once in a while, for instance, in old Babylonian times, so to speak, in the first half of the second millennium, the kings had to issue an order of freedom of old debts. That was made because a certain stratum of the population amassed quite a bit of wealth, so the interest rates were fixed by these upper rich people, and greater and greater parts of the population impoverished over the time. And this, of course, threatened the stability of the society. So the kings, once in a while, every 10 years, gave an order that all these old debts are cancelled. Yeah, and when I spoke to working people, what I sometimes do here in the Volkshochschule, it's called, it is a sort of Austrian educational institution for working people, You know, I immediately got a response, that's much the same as it is today. So yeah, and I said, yes, you are right. So you see, you have examples here and there, you can compare, and you may not find a solution, but you may get ideas how you can deal with problems. So that is usually very, very easy to tell people when they are interested what is interesting about our field. Speaking about writing, it is interesting that it sprang up as a purely pictographic form of writing, much in the same way as we use today, let us say, traffic signs and such things. At a certain point, it became necessary actually to pronounce these signs, because it was important that you gave names, personal names or place names, and so you developed a system of syllabic values, and later that's already happened in the third millennium. And yeah, it took another more than 1,000 years again before people were able or found it necessary to isolate vowels and consonants in writing. So that is, if you explain this to interested people, it becomes immediately clear how important it is for our culture.
Do you think that when you explain those types of things to people who ask you, I mean, before you use the example of workers who come to your house and ask you about your field, and when you begin to explain these types of things, it becomes more accessible to them. Do you think that they become interested in them?
Definitely,
suddenly?
yes, definitely. Yeah. Of course, you know, we live to a certain extent, even here in Europe, in an entertainment culture. So I'm not sure how long this interest, which springs up during our conversation, really helps. But a number of them might continue in reading books, history books, and such things. In fact, I know that a number of them did. So, well,
This goes back to the you know, the question of why should people care about Mesopotamia or about Iraq? And one question I'd like to ask is, do you think that there is a sort of decline in what we might call humanism?
Well, you know, I usually don't share a pessimistic attitude, because it has something to do with being a prophet, and I'm definitely not a prophet. What I observe is that there are quite a number of fields with interesting cultural developments going on, and another number of fields are increasingly neglected, especially historical subjects. I think there is a certain threat that humankind loses some of its riches, you know, as nature does with the dying out species, for instance, such things. So I would compare it in this way. It's a failure of me and my colleagues that it is so difficult for us, or we are not able to bring the message across, what is so interesting in these historical cultures. You must see, 5,000 years ago, you have a culture which is different and in a way similar to ours. They have models developed to deal with that and that problem. And it's very interesting, it even enriches our present day conception of our world, to see how this works. You know, that is, I think that's the main thing at stake with ancient Near Eastern studies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you see, this is a small country and a small undertaking, and that needs to be continued, that's for sure. And we always had a certain public response, and I think, yeah, we will continue to do that. We have no other choice, in fact. We have no other choice if we try to keep up the humanistic tradition we stand for. So Maybe that we are heard a little here and a little there, and that's enough as far as as I'm concerned. Of course, we would like to have a bigger audience, but you can have that at once. You know, there's no shocking news. There is a lot of sex and crime in ancient Near Eastern studies, but you have to get even this message to the people first. Yeah. Perhaps the following: I see the ancient Near Eastern studies or the Oriental studies altogether be endangered by increasing attitude against humanities altogether. And usually the argument put forward is an economic one. We do not produce history as you produce a car in a factory or a fridge in a factory or such things. What we engaged in is basic research, which costs very little, in fact, because our salaries are not that high and there are not so many people. And I think the outcome of it, in the middle or long run, could be of a value incredibly underestimated. Let me give one little example. If you look at the situation in Iraq, the situation with this horrible dictator Saddam Hussein, and everybody who has any humanistic tradition was very uncomfortable with this guy. And I'm sure 99% of my colleagues would have argued to get rid of him the sooner, the better. But our knowledge of the people and of the country prevented us actually to give this sort of support for the measurements decided upon by Wolfowitz and the Bush government, because we think the outcome is too costly, not only in matters of inherent economic disaster, but also concerning human lives, Iraqis as well as US people. So the few $1 million you have put into our field, our governments in Germany, in the United States or wherever, could have avoided the inherent disaster we are presently witnessing in Iraq. So I don't think that anybody can call, this economic unwise decision to give a little support to the humanities altogether. That would be a last point I would like to make.
That's an interesting example, and I would like to add one thing, which is that it's interesting to note that during the Second World War, precisely the example that you're using now occurred. The universities were effectively raided in order to provide that type of expertise to the military. So you could either be a frontline soldier or commander or whatever, or if you were a philologist, perhaps you were involved in code breaking, or if you were a geographer, you were involved in that type of study, and so forth and so on. In fact, there's this, as you know, there's this very useful set of books in our field, which were restricted up until the late 1950s, called the Naval Intelligence Guides. They were produced in England for use by the government and the intelligence services and the military, and they produced them for pretty much every country in the world because the entire world was at war. And precisely the way that those were produced was that they raided universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and they said, all of you scholars can either go and you can fight, or you can sit and do the research to produce these types of guides so that we know exactly what the geography is, what the ports are, what the languages are, what the tribal structures are, what the monetary structures are like, what the economy is like, and so forth and so on. In the particular case of the current war, it's interesting to note that among all the colleagues that I know in the United States, the US government did not seek to consult any of them. None of us were asked to participate. None of us were asked to say anything about the Middle East or to add what might have been positive expertise.
Yeah, my point would be that it really affects, even such remote subjects like ancient Near Eastern studies. and that you have to see it in the framework of misguided neglection of humanism and humanistic studies. And I think I fear, that is a bit pessimistic, I admit, I fear that the outcome of it will be much more costly in the long run than it's envisaged now. Well, speaking of the situation at the moment, I think, sadly to say, there is no easy way out. I'm convinced that if the American government changes to a certain extent the attitude and, let us say, is willing to collaborate with things like the UNO and to employ international law and such things, we, meaning the European governments in this case, will and must assist in bringing the situation in Iraq under control. I think this is our mutual interest. It's the interest of Europe and it's the interest of the ancient Near East. The ways how we could do it is very, very difficult because the situation was so much worsened over the last years. So you already have, let us say, in Iraqi Kurdistan, quite a sizable number of people longing for independence, and they won't go back in this in a state which is put upon them by the Allied forces or, let us say, Europe or wherever. And I think that the only chance we actually have to bring terrorism, the fundamentalism of the Islamic sort under control, is that we refrain of Western fundamentalism. And yeah, then that's the way I would say we could start tomorrow. But again, it depends not on my decision, but on the willingness and foresight of the politicians.
How do we bring Western fundamentalism under control? That's a problem. How do we bring Western fundamentalism under control?
That is the problem. You know, the strange thing is that to a certain extent there is, of course, there is a tradition from Ibn al-Wahhab from the 18th century in Saudi Arabia where Islamic fundamentalism is based upon. That is the movement back to the original Islam, okay, yeah? But the Islamic fundamentalism actually grew under the confrontation with the Christian or American fundamentalism. That is a truth. And as long as you have these both parties not clearly separated by people who are knowing that we live in one world and are one humankind, not branches and clashes of civilization, all this silly stuff, the longer we have no solution. That's the problem.
Just to make it explicit, is the United States government a fundamentalist government?
I think so. As far as I can judge from the outside, you know, they interfere in the life of private American citizens. Unbelievable for us in Europe who consider for decades the United States to be the, let us say, the hoard of individualistic freedom and all this sort of thing. This is unbelievable, but when we see it from here, we only wonder, you know, as well as the willingness, you know, to adopt this sort of lies which were used in the pretext of the Iraqi war. That is the damage is not, of course there is a lot of damage done physically, but the damage made in the minds of the Arab people, you know, who, some of them really were longing for this sort of freedom America uses as propaganda. That is the bad thing. They don't believe them anymore, and that will take a long time to rebuild the trust in that the West together speaks of something meaningful to them when the West speaks about democracy, freedom, and such things. That will take quite a... That is the effort we need.
I remember you once said to me, well, not long after the outbreak of the war and about halfway through the current administration, that what really shocked you was that as part of the post-war generation in Germany, you really believed in the ideals of American democracy, and that all of a sudden
correct,
you find yourself in a situation where the United States is not adhering to this.
Yeah, not only me, you know, that is till a couple of years ago, there may have been criticizing things going on, and of course, as you know, you not necessarily agree on every point, but the impression I increasingly had over the last years, and as I said, not only me, is that the values America used to stand for are doubted by lots of people, and rightly doubted so.
I'm worried. Is democracy still exportable as a concept, as a philosophical concept, as a cultural concept? Is this damage irreparable?
Not in the way it is done nowadays, but I think that if we have the possibility to return or to stand to the concept of human rights, that, as we did in the humanistic tradition, I think that is still worth to fight for. What else we have?